The coffee cup trembled in her hands. Who slightly, but enough to send tiny ripples across the surface of what had gone cold hours ago. Sarah's eyes were fixed on the window, watching the driveway where tire marks from his morning run still pressed into the gravel. She hadn't moved from that chair since 6 a.m., when the alarm clock had shattered what little sleep either of them had managed to steal. Her lips curved upward, a practiced motion she'd perfected over 18 months of deployment cycles. The smile that fooled neighbors, that reassured his worried mother over video calls, that convinced even herself sometimes. But today, the smile felt foreign on her face, like wearing someone else's clothes. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made her breath catch. Heavy boots. Heavy boots. The same boots that had walked through their front door after basic training, after advanced courses, after countless temporary goodbyes. But this time those footsteps carried a different weight, the kind that echoes in empty hallways long after the person has gone. She set the cup down carefully, her wedding ring making the smallest clink against the ceramic. The sound seemed to hang in the air, suspended between what was and what was about to be. Because in exactly 47 minutes, those boots would walk out that same front door, and tease time no one knew when they'd walk back in. The smile wavered for just a moment before she caught it, pressed it back into place. After all, she'd promised herself she would be strong. She'd promised him she would be the woman he could carry in his heart across oceans and through whatever darkness waited ahead. But promises, she was learning, are so much easier to make than to keep. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres had been home for exactly 14 days. 2 weeks of normalcy that felt like borrowed time, morning runs through their quiet neighborhood, late-night conversations that stretched until dawn, and the simple miracle of rolling over to find her still there, warm and real, beside him. 14 days to pretend that the olive-green duffel bag in their closet wasn't counting down the hours. Sarah had memorized every detail of those days with the desperate precision of someone preparing for drought. The way his laugh rumbled through his chest when she'd burned the pancakes on Sunday morning, how his calloused hands that had assembled rifles in the dark and carried wounded brothers to safety could still cradle her face with the gentleness of someone handling glass. The particular silence that fell over him when he thought she wasn't looking, his eyes distant, already halfway to wherever the army was sending him next. The orders had arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a young lieutenant who couldn't have been more than 22. Operation Resolute Guardiana, name that sounded like it belonged in a movie, not stamped across the papers that would take her husband away for at least 18 months, maybe longer. Classified location was all they were allowed to know, which meant the kind of place where phone calls came sporadically and letters arrived with half the words blacked out by censors. On their kitchen table, his deployment gear lay arranged with military precision. Body armor that had saved his life twice before, a tactical vest with pockets for ammunition and medical supplies, night vision goggles that would help him see through darkness she couldn't even imagine. Next to it, all looking almost absurd in its delicacy, sat the small silver locket she'd given him on their wedding, the one that held a photograph of them dancing at their reception, her dress flowing around them like captured joy. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath. Their golden retriever, Max, hadn't left Michael's side since the duffel bag appeared, as if the dog's instincts understood what human words couldn't quite capture. Even the morning light streaming through their bedroom window felt different, sharper somehow, more urgent, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny prayers in the space between staying and leaving. This wasn't their first goodbye, but it felt different, heavier. Previous deployments had come with training exercises and routine missions, with video calls that arrived predictably and return dates circled on calendars. This time, the silence around his orders spoke louder than any briefing could. This time, when he'd held her close last night, his grip had lingered just a moment too long, the kind of embrace that feels like memorization. Now, As Sarah sat in her chair by the window, she could hear him moving around upstairs, checking and double-checking equipment he'd already inspected a dozen times. The sounds of a soldier preparing for war, even though the war this time felt like it was happening right here in their living room, measured in minutes instead of miles. The ritual had begun 3 days ago, though neither of them had spoken its name aloud. It started with small things, Michael, washing his favorite coffee mug twice, as if cleanliness could somehow preserve the memory of their morning conversations. Sarah finding herself cooking his preferred meals with an almost manic attention to detail, seasoning each dish like it was a love letter he could taste months from now. She'd watched him fold his civilian clothes with the same precision he applied to his uniforms, each t-shirt and pair of jeans disappearing into drawers that would remain untouched until his return. But it was the way he'd lingered over his old leather jacket, the one he'd worn on their first date, that had made her excuse herself to the bathroom, where she'd gripped the sink and breathed through the wave of grief that threatened to pull her under. The house had become a museum of almost the last time he'd mowed the lawn, the last time they'd watched their Sunday night movie curled together on the couch, the last time she'd fallen asleep to the sound of his breathing. She'd found herself cataloging sensations with desperate precision, the warmth of his hand finding hers in the dark, the way he hummed unconsciously while shaving, the particular quality of his silence when he was thinking about something he couldn't share. Yesterday, she'd discovered him sitting on their bed, holding a photograph from their honeymoon in Greece. They were standing on a cliff overlooking the Aegean Sea, her arms wrapped around his waist, both of them laughing at something she couldn't remember now. His thumb had been tracing the edge of her face in the photo, and when he'd noticed her watching, he'd simply said, "I want to remember you exactly like this." The words had lodged somewhere between her throat and her heart, too heavy to swallow, too precious to let go. This morning, she'd awakened to find his side of the bed already empty, sheets still warm with the ghost of his presence. Through the bathroom door, she could hear the electric razor, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat over 5 years of marriage. But today, even that ordinary sound felt weighted with finality. The kitchen had become their silent battleground of normalcy. He'd made coffee strong and black, the way he'd learned to drink it overseas while she'd prepared eggs. They both knew neither of them would finish. They'd moved around each other with the careful choreography of people trying not to acknowledge that time was running out, passing salt and sharing sections of the newspaper as if this were just another Tuesday morning. But the calendar on the refrigerator told a different story. 18 months of empty squares stretched ahead, marked only by holidays she'd have to celebrate alone and anniversaries that would pass unobserved. She'd already started the mental arithmetic that military wives know by heart, dividing time into video calls, measuring distance in delayed text messages, calculating love in care packages and prayer. The weight of unspoken words pressed against the walls of their home. All the conversations they hadn't had because speaking certain fears aloud might make them real. All the promises they couldn't make because fate doesn't honor good intentions. All the reassurances that felt too fragile to voice in the face of classified missions and redacted locations. In the corner of their bedroom, his deployment bag waited like a patient predator. Sarah had helped him pack it 2 nights ago, folding socks and t-shirts around body armor, tucking photographs between boots that would carry him across foreign soil. Her hands had trembled as she'd placed their wedding photos in the front pocket, the same spot where he'd carried it. Through 2 previous deployments, the edges now soft with handling. The doorbell would ring soon. The transport that would take him to the airport, then 2 bases with names she wasn't allowed to know, and finally 2 places that existed only in news reports and her nightmares. But for now, for these last precious minutes, they were still just Michael and Sarah Torres, husband and wife, sharing coffee in their kitchen while morning light painted ordinary shadows on familiar walls. The sound of his boots on the hardwood floor, announced that the preparation was complete. The ritual of leaving had reached its final stage. Michael stood at the top of the stairs, his hand resting on the banister that he'd installed himself during his last leave, when home improvement projects felt like investments in a future, not reminders of what he was abandoning. The weight of his tactical vest pressed against his chest, but it was nothing compared to the weight settling in his stomach as he listened to Sarah's coffee cup clink against the saucer downstairs. He'd been a soldier for 8 years, long enough to know that leaving never got easier. It just got more familiar. But this mission felt different in ways that had nothing to do with the classified briefings or the equipment manifest that had required 3 separate signatures, this time when Colonel Martinez had handed him his orders. The older man's eyes had held a gravity that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult phone calls to other wives, other families. The silver locket felt warm against his chest, tucked beneath his dog tags, where it had ridden through every mission since their wedding day. Inside it, their faces smiled back at each other, from a time when the future had seemed as certain as their love, when 18 months apart was just a number on paper instead of a sentence measured in missed birthdays and empty beds. He'd written the letter 3 times before sealing it in the envelope, now hidden in his sock drawer, the one Sarah would find if things went wrong. The words had come harder than any after-action report he'd ever filed. How do you summarize 5 years of marriage in a few paragraphs? How do you say goodbye to someone who's become the rhythm of your breathing, the soundtrack to every dream about coming home? The worst part wasn't the mission itself, though the briefings had painted pictures that would visit his dreams for months to come. The worst part was the mathematics of love and duty that every career soldier learned to calculate. 20 years of service for a full pension, against the cost of missed anniversaries and delayed children, and the particular exhaustion that comes from loving someone from a distance, measured in time zones and satellite delays. Sarah didn't know about the nightmares that had started the day his orders arrived, not the ones about combat, which he'd learned to manage, but the ones where he came home to find their house empty, where 5 years of marriage dissolved into forwarding addresses and divorce papers served by strangers, the ones where love wasn't strong enough to survive the particular torture of never knowing when the phone might ring with news that would change everything. He could hear her moving around the kitchen now, the familiar sounds of her morning routine that he'd memorized over countless leaves and brief visits home, the way she hummed softly while washing dishes, how she always checked the locks twice before bed. The particular laugh she saved for his terrible jokes, all of it, would have to sustain him through months of mess hall meals and bunk-down nights, where home felt like something he'd imagined. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with the text he'd been dreading. Transport arriving in 15 minutes. 15 minutes to finish becoming the man who could walk away from everything that mattered, who could shoulder a rifle and follow orders into whatever darkness waited on the other side of classified coordinates. The photograph tucked into his helmet showed Sarah asleep on their couch last Sunday, sunlight streaming across her face, one hand curled under her cheek like a child's. He'd taken it without her knowing, wanting to capture the piece she wore when she wasn't trying to be strong for him. That photograph would travel with him to places where peace was a luxury and sleep came in, fragments between artillery rounds and early morning patrols. Michael touched the wedding ring on his finger, the simple gold band they'd chosen together at a small jewelry store in downtown Colorado Springs. Back when they thought deployment schedules were someone else's problem, he'd wear it through everything that was coming, a talisman against the forgetting that distance and time and exhaustion could bring. The hardest part of leaving wasn't saying goodbye. The hardest part was believing he deserved to come home to someone who had spent 18 months learning to live without him, who might discover that independence suited her better than waiting. But that was a fear too large to speak aloud, too dangerous to examine in the harsh light of morning reality. Downstairs, Sarah was waiting, trying to be strong, trying to smile, trying to pretend that love was enough to bridge any distance. And maybe it was. Maybe 18 months was just another mission to complete, another test to pass together. But first, he had to walk down those stairs and begin the longest journey of his life. The first step down felt like stepping off a cliff. Each boot heel against hardwood marked another second closer to goodbye, another heartbeat in the countdown that had been ticking in his chest since the moment his orders arrived. Michael could see Sarah's reflection in the hallway, mirror still, sitting by the window, her shoulders held with the rigid posture of someone fighting to keep herself together. She turned when she heard him coming, and the smile that spread across her face was both heartbreaking and perfect, the same smile she'd worn when he'd surprised her with leave last Christmas, when he'd returned early from training exercises, when he'd proposed on the beach in San Diego with sand in his boots and forever in his voice. But now that smile carried the weight of ending, polished bright to hide the cracks beneath. "Coffee's still warm," she said, though they both knew he wouldn't drink it. His stomach had been in knots for hours, the way it always got before missions. But this time, the anxiety had nothing to do with enemy contact or tactical objectives. This time, the mission was letting go of the only person who had ever made him want to stay. The kitchen clock, a wedding gift from her grandmother, ticked with merciless precision. 7:42 a.m. The transport would arrive at 8 o'clock. 80 minutes to fit a lifetime of goodbye into words that would never be enough. 18 minutes to memorize the way morning light caught the gold in her hair, the exact shade of brown in her eyes when she was trying not to cry. Max wandered between them, his tail low but still wagging hopefully, the way dogs do when they sense something wrong but can't understand the permanence of it. The golden retriever had been Michael's constant shadow since the deployment bag appeared, sleeping outside their bedroom door like a furry sentinel against the inevitable. Even now, the dog's eyes tracked between them, reading the tension in their careful movements around each other. Sarah busied herself, wiping down counters that were already clean, her movements sharp and efficient, the kind of cleaning that had nothing to do with dirt and everything to do with keeping her hands from shaking. She'd been doing this for 3 days now, polishing their home to a shine that would have to last until his return, as if perfection could somehow protect what they were leaving behind. "I put extra coffee in the freezer," she said without looking at him. "The good stuff from that place downtown for when you get back." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with all the hope and fear that came with making plans for a future that felt impossibly distant. Outside, a car door slammed somewhere down the street, probably Mr. Henderson leaving for his commute to the office, unaware that his ordinary Tuesday morning was occurring alongside their extraordinary goodbye. The sound made them both freeze, hearts jumping at what could have been the transport arriving early. Breath held until they realized it was just the world continuing to turn while there's ground to a halt. Michael reached for her then, his calloused hands finding her face, thumbs tracing the high cheekbones he'd memorized in a dozen different lights, candlelight from their anniversary dinners, harsh fluorescent from the base hospital when she'd waited through his surgery, soft dawn light like this, when everything felt suspended between dreams and waking. "I need you to know," he started, then stopped, the words catching in his throat like shrapnel. How could he explain that she had become his definition of home? That every letter he would write would be a prayer for the strength to make it back to this kitchen, to this woman who had chosen to love a soldier despite knowing the cost. The refrigerator hummed to life, its motor covering the sound of her breathing growing uneven. On the door, held by a magnet shaped like the Colorado state flag, was the calendar where she'd counted down his leave days in red ink, 14 marks that had passed too quickly, leading to this morning when the counting would reverse, measuring absence instead of presence. 7:46 a.m. Somewhere across town, other military families were having this same conversation, these same silences filled with everything that couldn't be said. But that knowledge didn't make it easier. It only underscored how their private grief was part of a larger mathematics of sacrifice that most people would never have to calculate. Sarah's phone buzzed on the counter probably, her sister texting, "Good luck," or her mother calling to check in, or any of the dozen people who cared about them but couldn't possibly understand the weight of this moment. Neither of them moved to answer it. The outside world could wait. These last minutes belonged only to them. Through the window, Michael could see the empty street where the transport would soon appear, a government vehicle that would carry him away from everything that mattered and toward everything he'd sworn to protect. The irony wasn't lost on him leaving the life he loved to defend the freedom to live it. The clock ticked toward 7:47. 13 minutes remaining. "Lucky 13, Sarah used to say, back when numbers were just numbers and time was something they had plenty of. Now, 13 felt like trying to hold water in cupped hands, precious and impossible to keep. He could hear it then, the distant rumble of an engine, still blocks away but unmistakably approaching. The sound that would end their borrowed time and begin the longest 18 months of their lives. The engine sound grew closer, its diesel rumble cutting through the morning quiet like a countdown timer made audible. Sarah's hand found his chest, fingers splaying over his heart, as if she could memorize its rhythm, carry it with her through all the silent nights ahead. Through the tactical vest, through the layers of duty and uniform, she could still feel the man who had promised her forever in a church filled with flowers and hope. "Don't," she whispered, though he hadn't said anything. "Don't say goodbye. Don't make this real. Don't let 18 months start with words that taste like ending." The rumble stopped outside their house. Through the sheer curtains, they could see the olive-green vehicle idling in their driveway, exhaust visible in the cool morning air. The driver remained inside, following protocol, giving families these last precious moments that the military had learned to measure in mercy rather than minutes. Michael's arms encircled her then, pulling her against him with a desperation that spoke louder than any words they'd struggled to find. She fit against him the way she always had, her head tucked perfectly beneath his chin, her arms wrapped around his waist like she was trying to anchor him to this moment, to this kitchen, to this life they'd built together one coffee-scented morning at a time. "I love you," he said into her hair, the words muffled but carrying the weight of everything they hadn't said, everything they couldn't promise, everything they hoped would still be true when he walked back through that door. "I love you in ways I don't have words for." She pulled back just enough to look at him, her hands framing his face the way she had on their wedding day, thumbs tracing the scar above his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a training accident that had terrified her before she learned that loving a soldier meant making peace with danger as a constant companion. Her eyes, those brown eyes that had been his North Star through every deployment, were bright with unshed tears that she refused to let fall. "Come home to me," she said, and it wasn't a request, it was a command issued with all the authority of 5 years of marriage. 2 miscarriages they'd weathered together, countless nights of waiting for phone calls that meant he was alive for another day. "Come home to me exactly as you are." The uniformed driver stepped out of the vehicle, his movement visible through the window, a polite reminder that duty doesn't pause for love, that missions begin on schedule, regardless of how many pieces of your heart you're leaving behind. Max went softly from his spot by the back door, the dog's instincts understanding what human logic tried to deny. 18 months, Michael said, his forehead pressed against hers, breathing the same air, existing in the same space for these last seconds when they were still just husband and wife, instead of soldier and the woman who would wait for him. 18 months. And then we start the rest of our lives. The knock on the front door came soft, slithery, gentle raps that respected the sacredness of the moment while acknowledging its end. Neither of them moved. The driver could wait another minute, another breath, another heartbeat of borrowed time before duty claimed what duty demanded. Sarah's thumb traced his lower lip, the same gesture she'd made the morning they'd gotten married, when he'd been fumbling with his tie and she'd stepped close to fix it. close enough that he could smell her perfume and see the future reflected in her eyes. "I'm going to watch you walk to that car," she said, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening beneath her calm surface. "And then I'm going to come inside and start counting days until you walk back through that door." He kissed her then, not the gentle goodbye kiss he'd planned, but something fierce and desperate. A kiss that tasted like coffee and tears and promises they were both afraid to make, but couldn't help believing. Her hands fisted in his tactical vest, holding on until the very last second, when holding on became the cruelest thing either of them could do. When they broke apart, her lipstick had left the faintest mark on his mouth, a blessing he would carry with him through whatever darkness waited ahead. Proof that this moment had been real, that love like theirs could survive any distance, any silence, any fear. The knock came again, more insistent this time, the real world calling them back from the suspended animation of goodbye, demanding that time resume its forward march toward separation and uncertainty, and the particular courage required to love someone from thousands of miles away. Michael picked up his duffel bag, the same one that had traveled with him through 3 deployments, now carrying everything he would need to survive, except the one thing that made survival worthwhile. Sarah walked with him toward the front door, their fingers intertwined, each step echoing in the hallway like a funeral march for the life they were leaving behind. At the threshold, she stopped. Protocol was clear: wives didn't accompany soldiers to the transport. Goodbyes happened at the doorway, not in driveways where other neighbors might witness the private breaking of hearts. This was where she would stand and watch him walk away, where she would begin the mathematics of waiting that would define the next 18 months of her life. "I love you, Staff Sergeant Torres," she said, using his rank like a prayer, like a promise that she would remember not just the man but the mission that was taking him from her. "I love you, Mrs. Torres," he replied, stepping across the threshold and into the morning that would carry him away from everything that mattered. "Hold the fort until I get back." She managed to smile. Then not the practiced one she'd been wearing like armor, but the real one, the one that belonged only to him, bright and broken and beautiful. The smile that said she would wait, she would endure, she would love him across any distance the world could create. The car door slammed with a finality that echoed off the houses in their quiet neighborhood, marking the end of this chapter and the beginning of counting days instead of sharing them. Sarah stood in the doorway long after the transport had disappeared around the corner, long after the sound of its engine had faded into the ordinary morning symphony of suburban life: lawnmowers starting up, coffee makers gurgling to life, children calling to each other as they waited for school buses. The world had resumed its rhythm, indifferent to the fact that hers had just been shattered and rebuilt in the space of a single goodbye. The house behind her felt different already, as if Michael's absence had changed the very physics of their home. Rooms that had hummed with shared energy now echoed with a hollowness that would take months to fill with new routines, new ways of being alone that didn't feel like punishment. The coffee pot still held enough for 2 cups, a small miscalculation that would become a daily reminder of the mathematics of loss. Max appeared beside her, his warm weight pressing against her legs as they both stared down the empty street. Dogs understand loyalty in ways that transcend language, and his vigil would continue for weeks, years, perking up at every car door, every footstep that might announce the return of his favorite human. In his simple devotion, Sarah recognized her own heart, reflected back, the faithful waiting, the hope that refuses logic, the love that endures beyond sight. She closed the door slowly, each inch of movement sealing away the morning that had changed everything. The silver frame on the hallway table held their wedding photo, young faces bright with the invincibility of new love. Before they'd learned that forever was something you built day by day, deployment by deployment, goodbye by painful goodbye. That couple had believed love was enough. This older, wiser version of herself knew better. Love wasn't enough, but it was everything. The 18 months stretched ahead like an unmapped territory. There would be video calls that cut out at crucial moments, letters delayed by military censors, and the peculiar time zone mathematics that would govern the relationship, calculating when it was safe to call, when he might be sleeping, when silence meant safety versus when it meant something unspeakable had happened. She would learn to read between the lines of his carefully worded emails, to hear the things he couldn't say in the pauses between his words. But she would also discover strength she didn't know she possessed. She would take the photography class she'd always talked about, finally finish the novel that had been collecting dust in her desk drawer, maybe even adopt the rescue cat she'd been considering. Not to fill the emptiness, nothing could do that, but to prove to herself that life could expand even in the presence of loss, that waiting didn't have to mean suspended animation. There would be hard days ahead. Days when other couples' easy intimacy would feel like salt in wounds that refused to heal. Nights when his side of the bed remained cold despite the heating blanket she'd learned to use during his last deployment. Moments when she would catch herself setting two places at the dinner table or buying groceries for two people out of habit and hope. But there would also be the moment she could feel it, waiting somewhere in the distant future, when she would hear his key in the lock again, when those same boots would cross their threshold, carrying him home instead of away. The mathematics of reunion were different from the mathematics of separation. 18 months of absence collapsing into a single moment of return. Distance measured in heartbeats instead of time zones. Love proven not by words, but by the simple miracle of shared presence. This was the particular courage required of military families, the ability to love with open hands, to build homes strong enough to survive repeated departures, and patient enough to welcome repeated returns. It was a love that existed in letters and care packages, in delayed text messages and interrupted phone calls, in the faith that some bonds transcend physical proximity. As Sarah picked up his coffee mug, still warm, still faintly scented with his aftershave, she understood that she wasn't just waiting for Michael to come home. She was holding space for the life they would build together when he did, keeping their love alive across whatever distances duty demanded, proving that some promises are strong enough to survive 18 months of testing. Outside, Mrs. June was watering her garden. The same routine she'd maintained for the 15 years Sarah had lived in this neighborhood. Normal life continuing its appointed rounds, while extraordinary love wrote itself across the ordinary canvas of Tuesday morning in suburban Colorado. The constancy was comforting, a reminder that while her world had shifted, the world itself remained steady, patient, ready to welcome Michael home when his mission was complete. She raised his mug in a small salute to the empty street, to the invisible distance he was already traveling, to the 80 months that stood between this morning and the next time she would hear his key in their door. "Come home to me," she whispered again, the words now a daily prayer that would sustain her through whatever lay ahead. Because love like theirs didn't end with goodbyes. It simply learned new ways to exist across time and space, carried in the hearts of those brave enough to choose each other again and again, deployment after deployment, until someday became today and waiting became reunion. If this story of courage, sacrifice, and unbreakable love touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who understands that the strongest bonds are often tested by the greatest distances. Because every military family has a story like this one, and every story deserves to be witnessed, honored, and remembered.